There are many ways that these seed oils get into our diets. Seed oils are sold as vegetable oils with the idea that somehow they're healthy. However, vegetables do not make these oils. Seed oils are purchased and added to food through baking and cooking, and especially when we buy processed food from our grocery stores, restaurants, or our bulk resellers. Seed oils are also very high in our livestock feeding operations, in our confined animal feeding operations. The primary use of corn, soy, cottonseed, and oil seeds are the predominant source of feed. And this includes our beef, our pork, our chicken, which is both the meat and the eggs, along with turkey. Even farm-raised fish are now fed high grain oil, seed oil diets. When you look at livestock grains that are typically fed on the omega-6 to the omega-3 ratio, we have tested various grain types to evaluate the omega-6 to the omega-3 ratio. Genetically modified corn is in excess of 35 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. Non-GMO corn is approximately 30 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. Chickpeas or garbanzo beans are just over 20 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. A trimix, which is a blend of wheat, barley, and triticale, is approximately 15 to 16, and wheat is about 16 to 17 omega-6s to omega-3. And these are part or primary components in our livestock feed of beef, pork, and chicken. However, in our food supply, processed foods, restaurant foods, they use the oil from the seeds, which has a much higher concentration of omega-6s to omega-3s. For example, palm oil is about 45 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. Refined corn oil, over 80 to 1. Look at cottonseed oil at 110 to 1. Rice bran oil at 130 plus omega-6s to 1 omega-3. Sesame oil, almost 140 to 1. And safflower oil, which is 150 to 1. These are so highly oxidative and inflammatory. And these are the main components used in processed foods. Many restaurants also use these oils in cooking and especially in deep frying. Just a word of precaution here, when these seed oils are heated, their potential for oxidization is increased dramatically. And at certain temperatures, they go from oxidizing fats into trans fats, which are immensely more toxic. The major shifts we've seen over the last 75 to 100 years in meat. We've gone from grazing, grass-fed and finished animals, into feedlot animals, fed primarily grains, high seed oils. Our grazing animals ate natural forages. They had a very healthy omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, typically of 1 to 1 or 2 to 1. They're non-oxidizing, very stable, non-inflammatory fats. However, it required more time, approximately 2.5 to 3 years, to produce a mature grass-fed animal for slaughter. The drawbacks were because they were very lean, there was less flavor, and they had a tougher texture just simply due to age. The feedlot system improved the time, taking it from 2.5 to 3 years down to approximately 2 years or a little bit less. The grain-fed diets were high in starch and seed oils. This was also very high in the omega-6 essential fatty acids, which are highly oxidative, highly inflammatory. The meat has a better flavor, but it is very toxic and extremely unhealthy for our consumption. So what allowed this natural shift from grazing into feedlots? Well, in 1917, the USDA began voluntary grading of meat. By 1927, grading appears on the meat packaging. By 1935, 5% of beef came from feedlot type operations. Now, with the introduction of antibiotics in the 1940s, this allowed for a much higher density of animal populations in feedlots. By 1945, there was a shift to feedlot packing house operations, and with low grain prices in the 50s, this encouraged the expansion of feedlot. By 1963, 66% of the beef in the U.S. were grain-fed beef in feedlots. By 2012, 97% of the beef in grocery stores were from grain-fed feedlots. When we take a close-up look at the omega-6 to the omega-3 ratios of our grains, again, we have to realize that we are what we eat. So if we're trying to avoid high omega-6 essential fatty acids in our diet due to the health problems and the high oxidation and inflammation, we need to also avoid the sources that eat those high seed oils as their primary food sources. Because if they eat the seed oils and we eat them, we inherit the same properties of the high seed oils, which is oxidation, inflammation, and disease. GMO corn, almost 35-1. Non-GMO corn, just under 30-1. Chickpeas at over 20, our trimix grains at around 15, and wheat just over around 16 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. This is a small representation of the extensive testing that we have been conducting over years in accumulating data on the omega-6 to the omega-3 ratios in various protein sources such as pork, beef, lamb, chicken, eggs, bison, etc., and in the various categories of grain-fed, seed oil-based, grass-fed, and our fermented forage omega balance natural beef, bison, and lamb. In looking at the grain-based or high seed oil type diets, we find omega-6 to omega-3 balances from 7-8-1 up to as high as almost 30-1. And this depends on the ratio of corn, the ratio of soy, the ratio of wheat and barley that are in the feed blend. More corn is going to give a higher omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. Less corn and more grain and barley, wheat and barley, will give a little bit lower omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. But again, focusing on the level of 2.5-1 that we do not want to go above, we see that anything grain, seed oil based fed is going to be way in excess of those numbers. Starting from the left, we have a grocery store pork chop. That was measured at 28.7 omega-6 to 1 omega-3. You can tell that's predominantly corn-fed. Next, coming in at 26.5 omega-6s to 1 omega-3, is an internet beef cells company selling American Wagyu, which is simply a cross of Black Angus and Wagyu. This is a prime cut ribeye that sells for $58 for 6 ounces. That translates into $155 a pound. And to my point earlier, this is a highly marbled, fatty steak. It would be considered at the top of prime, and it is extremely toxic. At 26.5 to 1, that's highly inflammatory. The next one is a national internet beef cell company. Again, you can tell that they're predominantly corn-fed. This comes in at 20.5 to 1. And these companies offer monthly subscriptions to this meat. The next, RBR Beef, is a private membership type operation where meat is sold to their members. While they advertise predominantly grass-fed with that healthy image, they are also grain finished to put on the extra marbling and flavor. And as you can see, that particular steak or meat comes in at 7.4 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. Store-bought lamb. New Zealand prime lamb, tested at 7.14 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. And you can tell they're finishing them with grain. They have to get the omega-6s this high. Now here's something to watch for. Organic chicken. Everyone assumes that because you're eating organic, you're eating healthy. Now, organic is the premise that we are avoiding the GMO grains. We're avoiding chemicals and toxins that conventional agricultural practices routinely use. However, organic corn, organic wheat, organic barley, organic soy has very, very high elevated omega-6s and to omega-3s. So eating organic chicken or organic pork or organic beef that is raised with high grain-based diets, you're still getting the cellular toxicity from the high omega-6s. You may have avoided the environmental toxins, but you haven't avoided the oxidization and cellular damage. Generic chicken from a grocery store again, 16 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. Generic eggs, 14.5 to 1. So again, not just the meat, but the eggs are also very high in omega-6s. And that will vary depending upon the ratio of high omega-6 grains to lower omega-6 grains. The next is a bison study conducted by North Dakota State University and the University of Nebraska, where they took a large group of bison and part were fed grain and part were fed grasses. The bison that were grain-fed came back at 21 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. Again, you can tell the diet had to be predominantly corn. Now, here's my complaint with the bison industry. The bison industry is trying to compete with the beef industry in producing meat. So they've taken them from grazing, which takes up to 3 years, into feedlots to shorten the time by feeding them grain. However, when they switch from a grass-based diet into a grain-based high seed oil diet, the omega-6s skyrocket in the meat. Now, the bison industry promotes that bison is healthier than beef. And my contention is any meat is only as healthy as its diet. You feed bison the same way you feed beef, you get the same results. And our tests year after year after year verify this to be a fact. Any meat is only healthy because of the proper diet, not because it's a bison, not because it's a beef, a chicken, or a pig. Has nothing to do with it. The diet has everything to do with how healthy the end product is. In another bison test, there was grain and hay mixed and pelletized and fed. And so with a higher hay-based diet and a lower grain diet, you can see that this bison came in at 3.6 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. Much, much lower, but still a little bit too high. Now, we've taken grass-fed and grass-finished meat, and we've tested it. Our grass-fed beef came in at 1.4 to 1, which is a good, healthy ratio. That's very good. Our grass-fed bison from another farm came in at 2.2 to 1. Again, a very good, safe ratio. It's not going to cause high oxidation and inflammation. But this is typically where you see grass-fed animals, in that 1 to 1 and 2 to 1 range. They're going to have less flavor because there's less fat, and they're going to be a little tougher because they're older. This brings us to the lowest of the oxidation and inflammatory properties, with the highest quality, with excellent flavor, and being very tender. And these are the fermented forage beef that are raised by Biominerals Technologies, which we call Omega Balanced Natural Meats. Now, we've done this with beef, we've done it with bison, we've done it with lambs. And here are our results. Omega Balanced Natural Beef, 0.8 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. So we have lower 6s than we actually have of 3s. Our bison, 0.9 omega-6s to 1 omega-3s. Again, lower 6s than 3s. Our omega balanced natural meat with lambs, 1.1 to 1. Again, these are all grass and legume-based fermented forage diets. Our fermented forage diets consist of grasses, cereals, and legumes. And this gives us several very distinct advantages. By fermenting the forages, we have a very improved feed conversion ratio, which means we can feed much less forage per pound of gain. It means our animals gain weight quicker, they have the excess energy to produce fat, and because of the quicker growth and finishing time, they're very, very tender. And we have the healthiest omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid ratios of anybody I'm aware of. Our animals are never fed grain of any kind. They never receive vaccines, they never receive antibiotics, and they never have an implant. There are no chemical or drug uses within any of our feeding programs on any of our livestock. This cut is a T-bone. It would be considered prime, and it has great flavor and extreme tenderness, and there is no oxidation or inflammatory properties to this meat. The next was grass-fed beef, purchased at a regional grocery store. This was a New York cut that tested at 1.34 to 1. So we know it's honestly grass-fed and grass-finished. You can tell by the omega-6 to the omega-3 ratio. We further tested a Wagyu ribeye steak that resulted in 6.63 to 1 on the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. looking at omega balanced natural beef, we have our omega-6 to omega-3 ratio typically is in the 1-to-1 area. In 2021, we had, again, our meat tested by Utah State University Nutrition, Dietetics, and Food Services Department. Our meat came in at 0.83 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. As you can see, the grass-fed and finished would be very lean with very little fat, and so this would have less flavor and would be tougher. The price on this meat was $24.99 per pound. The grain-fed Wagyu steak at 6.63 to 1 would be much more oxidative and inflammatory. It is likely include the use of hormones, vaccines, and antibiotics because of the grain-based diet and the GMO feeds. These types of meat typically grade select, choice, and some prime. This steak that we purchased was $34.99 a pound. Again, it will have great flavor, but it would be very unhealthy choice of meat. In a side-by-side comparison, let's review the choices. Grass-fed is going to have a healthy omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, typically less than 2.5 to 1. And these are basically forage-fed animals. The problem in the industry is what constitutes grass-fed. And that can be anywhere from some grass-fed to predominantly grass-fed to all grass-fed. But when you look at organic grass-fed, there should be very few toxins. Grass-fed should not have vaccinations or antibiotics, but there are some exceptions and some uses allowed, which then kicks you into a different category. Grass-fed and grained finished is another category that you look at because what type of grains are they feeding? GMO grains like corn and soy, or are they organic grains? And what is the ratio of high seed oil to low seed oil seeds that are being fed? The complaints that we hear all the time with grass-fed is it's tough and it has less flavor than what they're used to in the grocery store. Now you look at feedlot beef, which is 97% or more of what you're going to encounter in grocery stores. They have improved flavor and improved tenderness because they have a shorter feeding period and they can put on animal fat because of the high contents of seed oils in the grains. However, you have a great deal of toxicity. Almost all, predominantly all of these feedlots employ the use of genetically engineered plants and grains, corn, soy, sugar beet byproducts. Even alfalfa now is almost 30% genetically modified, which means now you're going to have genetically engineered toxins. So you're going to have genetically altered carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. One of the traits in genetically engineered corn is the Bt toxin, which is the Bacillus thuringiensis, which is an insecticide that the corn produces to resist the influence of insecticides in the soil and on its leaves. The problem with this is that the Bt gene flows from the grain into the gut microflora, and then the animal begins to produce the insecticide internally. When we eat Bt sweet corn, the gene from the corn goes into our gut microflora, and then we begin to produce an internal insecticide. There is also the prolific and abundant use of glyphosate in genetically engineered crops. So that is a cellular toxin as well. With glyphosate in the feed, you now have a dramatic shift in the healthy gut microflora of the animal from the Enterococcus, Faecalis, and Faecium into the Clostridium botulinum and the botulinum neurotoxins because of the increase of pathogens. What glyphosate does is it kills the beneficial microbes and it massively stimulates the pathogenic populations. And so what you do is you lose those healthy, digestive, nutrient transforming microbes, and in place you end up with bacterium like Clostridium that destroy the tissue and produce neurotoxins that are then absorbed into the bloodstream. Glyphosate also ties up your trace minerals, which shuts down enzymatic functions in the cells. Glyphosate destroys your immune system as it destroys the beneficial gut microflora, which are the basis of 70 to 80% of your immune system. You lose that health. This is why I'm saying over and over, when you eat feedlot animals, you're eating very unhealthy, nutrient deficient, toxic meat. The animals experience the cell nucleus and mitochondria damage and dysfunction. There's neurological disorders. These also cause in humans depression, anxiety, Alzheimer's, dementia, and Parkinson's disease. And again, if our animals are eating the seed oils that contain glyphosate and other agricultural toxins, we get that. And that then causes cellular and mitochondria damage in our systems. In feedlots, there's a lot of drug usage. Antibiotics are a norm. They have to have them because of the high populations. And so animal consumption of antibiotics are 7 times that of the human population. Implants and hormones and injections are all common. There's routine vaccinations. And now the problem is we're learning that these animals are now being injected with the new mRNA gene therapy type vaccines. And much of the intent of vaccinating animals with mRNA type vaccines is that will in turn vaccinate us with the same technology. My personal opinion is that is something that should be avoided at any cost. As you know, the chemical toxicity, the herbicides, the glyphosate, Roundup, glufosinate, 2,4-D, the dicambas, the paraquats, fungicides, insecticides, pesticides, all of that end up in the food chain. And it ends up in our livestock and it ends up in our diet. This is one of the reasons that people advocate eating organically, is to try to avoid this genetic engineering toxicity, the drug toxicity, and the chemical toxicity. However, last but not least is the metabolic toxicity, this oxidation of omega-6s. And even the organic people are getting caught here. So when we look at these predominant oxidizing poisons that come from the breakdown of linoleic acid, you have this lipid hydroperoxidase process that creates such toxic compounds as 4-hydroxynonenal, malondialdehyde, your oxidized linoleic acid metabolites, your acrolein, and your carboxyethylpyrrole. Okay, these again are cytotoxic, which means they are toxic to your cells. They're genotoxic, which they damage genetic information within your cells. They're mutagenic. These cause and induce mutations. Carcinogenic, cancer-forming. Atherogenic, these are the fatty plaques inside our arteries causing cardiovascular disease. Thrombogenic, these are causing blood clotting. Obesogenic. This is causing the obesity crisis in the American population because of our diet. Teratogenic, causing the defects in the developing fetus. So feedlot grains of all kind, not just beef, but pork and chicken, all come with a massive load of toxicity. Omega balanced natural beef. We have the healthiest essential fatty acid ratios of typically that 1-to-1 ratio or even less. We have tremendous flavor because we have enough energy to produce fat in the short growing time that we have for our animals, which makes them very tender. Most of our meat grades prime or choice. We have very high feed efficiencies due to our fermentation program. We have higher nutrient contents. We have higher energy. Our animals are produced in 15 months or less. Our forages and all of the products we use in our fermentation processes can all qualify as organic. When we look at metabolic syndrome symptoms and the effects, some of the very first signs are high blood sugar, a reduction in ATP, which is the energy production cycle. It then moves to insulin insensitivity, which progresses to insulin resistance. That progresses to being pre-diabetic, and that moves on to becoming fully diabetic. This results in weight gain, which results in obesity. Through the process of fat cell accumulation, we develop non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and heart disease. This also results in mitochondria damage with cancers and more cardiovascular disease and much more. So, what is the solution? Do we simply turn to medical drugs to treat symptoms that never ends? Or do you actually want to get to the root of the problem? My firm belief is that our choices in food lie at the very base of our health. We have food for life and we have food for disease. The food for life has always been whole, natural, nutrient-dense foods, with our protein sources being primarily based in non-oxidizing, very stable, saturated fats. The food for disease has come from the introduction of seed oils, refined carbohydrates, and additional sugar. And these cause cellular and metabolic dysfunction with the mitochondria and all of the processes, external and internal, in the cell. These cause degenerative diseases of every kind, and these are the basis for the health and the disease epidemics we have in this country. Just as Hippocrates stated, "Let food be thy medicine, and medicine thy food." Section 8 Summary. Seed oils produce cellular toxins in our meats. Seed oils end up in the meats that we eat because of the high grain diets fed to feedlot beef and other animals. Ancestral beef was raised on grasses and legumes and was primarily grazed. Now, the majority of what you and I find in the grocery store is feedlot, grain-fed meat with very high omega-6 to omega-3 ratios. This grain-fed beef also contains many other cellular toxins because of the breakdown of these oxidative fatty acids. The GMO grains and the residues found from many drugs, vaccines, and hormones that are given to these animals, and also the environmental agricultural toxins that are so routinely used. Omega balanced natural beef is natural, it's organic, it's healthy, it's very flavorful, and it's tender, with an omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of generally around 1:1. What we consume determines our health, energy, and our vitality. The proper foods sustain and empower our metabolic systems to function according to its genetic design and its capacity. Thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation. We hope and pray that the information here is of great benefit to you and your family. God bless and take care.